We've got with us a great guest today. His name is Joe Pinion. He's New York's Republican senator candidate running against Chuck Schumer. And Joe sees the issues affecting communities firsthand. And if Joe wins his Senate race, he will be proudly representing over 78,000 AMAC members within the great state of New York. Candidate Joe Pinion, it's such a pleasure to have you here with me. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Well, great to join you. Thank you so much to you and to the entire AMAC community for welcoming me to your platform, and look forward to talking to you.
Thank you. You know, you're what I call the voice of authority, or I could say the voice of authenticity, because you really pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. You've always done what you said you would do. And New Yorkers and Americans really need that. We really crave that in our leaders today. I do want to start with an issue that is on so many minds, and that's crime, defunding police, the way the Democrat Party, Mr. Schumer in particular, have really victimized the average American, people just trying to protect their family and make ends meet, people who just want to get by. But you are a pro-police American, and you've talked a lot about public safety. The law enforcement community in New York has said that they're behind you, full stop, and you believe in the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment. So I want to ask you, as more people realize that their communities, their families really depend on the Second Amendment, keeping the Second Amendment alive, where are you on this fundamental right, on responsible gun ownership, gun rights, and concealed carry, the right of all Americans just affirmed by the Supreme Court to keep and bear arms?
Well, look, it seems as if every time the Supreme Court upholds our God-given constitutional rights to defend ourselves, there comes a Democratic governor somewhere from New York to California to everywhere in between, trying to strip them away before the ink is dry on the actual legal opinion. And so from my perspective, I'm quite clear. The Second Amendment is not for the elk, even though that's nice. It's to ensure that all the other amendments are safeguarded, to make sure that when the First Amendment breaks down and our respect for the rule of law breaks down, that people maintain their God-given right to defend themselves, defend their liberties, and if necessary, defend themselves from a tyrannical government. And I think that it's important that we protect the veracity of all our amendments, of all of our constitutional rights, at a time such as this, where we see the overreach of government more pervasive now than perhaps any other time in the modern era, certainly in my lifetime. And so I think it is critical that we have that difficult conversation, roll up our sleeves and talk about what does responsible gun ownership look like in the 21st century. But I can tell you what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like what Chuck Schumer and Kathy Hochul envisioned for New Yorkers, where they have made every single place on the planet a sensitive place, where the only place you can conceal your weapon is in your home, which actually defeats the purpose of carry permits in the first place.
Yeah. Well, thank you, because we know that Chuck Schumer disagrees with everything that you've just said. And we were the first to report on Chuck Schumer's extremism and his corrupt bargaining agreements. There was a New York TV blitz that was put out by Frontiers of Freedom Action. It was complete with footage of various Biden foreign and domestic policy fiascos, and really the charges that really say Schumer made a corrupt bargain with left-wing extremists to not run a primary against him if he pushed far-left positions. It also ties Schumer to opposition to school reform. He opposes parental rights, as well as the destruction of women's sports and childhood education with gender lunacy. What do you think about how he agreed to vote with the far left wing of the party so long as he didn't have to face a primary?
Well, look, as I say often, Chuck Schumer no longer works for the 19 million and shrinking that called New York State home. We lead the nation in outward migration. 1 million of our friends and neighbors have left, mostly because individuals like Charles Ellis Schumer have decided that our safety and security is not the priority. Our rights and our liberties are no longer sacrosanct. He is in the pocket of the big business interests, but he's also in the pocket of the far left lobby. And that's a terrible combination, because people who are trying to take America in a direction it was never intended by embracing policies that have never worked in the history of the world, and then combining that with the wealth that concentrates itself in his campaign coffers, leads to a scenario where a man who wields more power down in D.C. than any person not named Joseph Robinette Biden effectively goes unchecked, has zero tether to reality, And in that void, innocent people are getting hurt. We see that
Yeah.
on the southern border, where they have declared it the new Ellis Island, when in all reality it is an island of doom and despair, where children are now trafficked for sex in the name of this glorious nation, where we have now seen fentanyl become a leading cause of death for people aged 18 to 45 in this nation because of this open border policy that they have rubber stamped down there on our southern border. So again, there's a road of unintended consequences, or in the case of some people on the left, failure by design that starts with one man, Charles Ellis Schumer, 42 years down in Congress, 24 years in the United States Senate. And the results, they speak for themselves. America's headed in the wrong direction. But with the power of your members, with the power of the American people, and with the faith that I have in the voters of New York, we can turn that around starting November 8th.
That's right. And Joe, you grew up in New York, so you really are aware of how New York has suffered under Democrat leadership. Perhaps those who have suffered the worst are our children. You know, our children suffered through these draconian lockdowns and mask mandates. They've been exposed to violence like we've never seen before. And parents who exercise school choice, now we're hearing that they list safety and better schooling as the main motivators for taking their children out of public schools. How important, in your view, is school choice? And would school choice options help students escape school violence?
Absolutely. I think school choice is a critical issue. Education is the civil rights issue of our time. As I remind people consistently, here in New York State, 60% of all children are not reading at proficient levels. If you want to drill down on a demographic basis, we have 65% of Black and brown students in New York City that are not reading at grade level. This past week, we found out that 70% of the Black students that took the state math exam failed it. This is child abuse, any way you want to slice it. And so we need to remind people that while Chuck Schumer pats himself on the back and calls himself a progressive champion, we now have public schools in New York City more segregated today than the height of Jim Crow. And then I think, again, we need to talk about all of the ancillary causes and outcomes of these regressive policies. We have in New York State what I call a three-strand cord of despair. Obviously, we know about a three-strand cord marriage, but we have a different type of marriage, a covenant with death that we've made in this state because we have educational opportunities that have been denied. That lack of educational opportunity drives the entrenched poverty, and that entrenched poverty drives the crime. And we cannot break this vicious cycle until we have leadership that recognizes that these things are a problem. When you don't actually recognize that denying families choice, that not giving parents access to the $18,000 per pupil that is earmarked for every single student on average that we have in this state is abusive and regressive, then we are doomed to complete this cycle time and time and time again. And the compound effect this has on vulnerable communities, on minority communities, leaves us all in a place where, again, we now know that the America that was promised remains out of reach for the next generation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you're fighting for so many real community-driven solutions to help end the ravages of poverty and despair, because it really afflicts just far too many Americans. And it seems like Chuck Schumer it seems like he wants to put a Band-Aid on it, really expanding the child tax credit as part of his American Rescue Plan that he so loves. That does provide families with up to $3,600 per child, but he insists that this child tax credit will cut child poverty in half and boost families' incomes. We here at AMAC know that giving more government handouts does not really solve the underlying issue at hand. How would you leverage your talents to really help our nation's poorest rise out of poverty and help improve college accessibility, for example?
Well, look, I think, again, Chuck Schumer comes from a long line of Democrats who want to give people exactly what they need to stay exactly where they are. Which is well below what was promised in our founding documents. The solution to me is clear, that we need to have school choice as a right for every single family that calls this nation home, whether you want to homeschool your child or send your child to parochial school. Those dollars need to follow the child, and the parents should have the ability to do so. In the process, that would allow us to have more power over the curriculum that is being taught in those schools, and you'd be surprised how fast the actual infrastructure would change if suddenly parents had the ability to say, I don't like the fact that you're teaching my children about the mechanics of sex before they know how to spell the word, I'm going to withdraw them from this school, take the $18,000 that comes with it, and go to another place where my children can get an education more commensurate with what I think is beneficial for their future. So that to me is the first step. Beyond that, I think that we need to codify reading as a constitutional right for every single child that calls this nation home. Contrary to what many believe, we do not have that right as a constitutional right. Children have, through the courts, a right to a actual education. The actual specifics around that education do not specify that the children walking out of the buildings that our tax dollars pay for have to be literate. If it did, I think that, again, the actual impetus and the actual emphasis for where we spend our dollars, how the classroom is oriented, would shift. And that small shift makes a big difference for a lot of people. When you consider that down in Baltimore, 75% of the high school students are reading at an elementary school level. When you consider, again, here in New York, when the overwhelming majority of our children are not reading, when the results have come out that 1/4 of the public schools in New York State are failing 90% of the students, the majority of whom are minorities themselves. So this is the moment to make this a central point of what is happening in this country. You cannot secure America's future if the children who are destined to inherit it do not have the skills they need to thrive and excel.
That's right. And those statistics are real and they mean something, and they are the result of poor leadership. Despite Chuck Schumer claiming that he has worked very hard to improve the lives of American people, because we see that on his watch, crime continues to increase. According to NYPD crime statistics, major crime has increased by over 30% over 1 year period. Assaults are up by over 15%. Crime on city transit has jumped over 40%. It seems to me that a man, Chuck Schumer, who has been in office for over 40 years, has really turned a blind eye towards the state that he is supposed to be representing. What should we be doing now to reduce New York's soaring crime rates?
Well, look, it's very clear to me, first and foremost, you have to actually have a fear of accountability. There is no accountability in our laws anymore here in the state of New York between the cashier's bail that they passed and also the defunding of the police before they restored the police budget back to previous levels. What has happened in that wake, or in that gulf rather, is that we've seen officers resign in mass. We have seen communities overrun by criminals that should still be behind bars. And people should always be given a pathway to redemption. But redemption requires people to acknowledge the pain that they have ushered into the world. If they have not actually made that commitment to change, then us giving them a second chance is actually us, in many ways, weaponizing our own compassion at the expense of those who have done nothing wrong. Innocent people are being killed. Innocent people are being shot. We are in this campaign to tell what I have called the untold story of New York. That on Chuck Schumer's watch, we have watched as Rochester, New York now has a higher murder rate than Chicago, Illinois per capita. We have now watched with horror as Syracuse, New York now has the highest per capita rate of child poverty of any major city in the country. These are not talking points. This is real pain. This is real suffering that goes unaddressed. And as always is the case with Chuck Schumer, in the 11th hour, he shows up with a publisher's clearinghouse check that represents your hard-working taxpayer dollars. And he makes promises that are supposed to fix a problem he himself created.
Yeah, well, we've got less than 20 days away from the November 8th elections, and I have so much hope for America's future. We appreciate having you here with us today. What an absolute pleasure, and I'm glad that more and more New Yorkers will hear you, will know who you are, what you stand for, more than ever. If this has ever been a time to get out and vote this November 8th, now is the time. You do have so much courage, though. Just thank you for all that you're doing. It reminds me of AMAC. We always called ourselves the David against Goliath when we first formed. And I look at us today and say, wow, look how far we come. You've got that same courage, the courage of David confronting Goliath. you really are standing up and running for the U.S. Senate against a man who represents or is the living embodiment of privilege and elitism, getting rich on the public, ignoring the people. But what amazes me is that you are gaining on him, just like the famous character played by Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, because I feel like, when you talk here to me, sir, you're the everyman, the common man, the good man, the first Black American ever nominated for the Senate in New York. You are the Republican nominee to knock off the arrogance of Washington embodiment, embodied by Mr. Schumer. Thank you so much for being with me today. What an honor. I enjoyed this very much.
Well, we're truly grateful to be here. And again, people can learn more about us at joepinion.com. They can give at joepinion.com if they're so inclined. Every dollar truly does matter. And again, we need a little bit of an investment today to strike the blow that will never be forgotten on November 8th. So no matter what you do, remind your friends, this is the whole state, the whole kit and caboodle here to make sure that we can defeat Chuck Schumer. So I appreciate the opportunity to address your members, because this is the fight. Our thesis has been, if you are unhappy with the world as it is today, you cannot vote for the architects who built it. And there is no greater architect in American politics today than Charles Ellis Schumer. And if we don't want to see what we know is coming, this continued careening towards an America that is unrecognizable, then we must plant our feet firmly. We must stand up for our freedoms and our liberties, because our freedoms are on the ballot. As Reagan told us, they are not passed down in the bloodstream. We must fight for them. And I'm looking forward to winning this fight with every single one of you and the New Yorkers who want to take their state back and turn this country around.
Thank you, Joe. And I want to thank every one of you out there listening. Thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can listen to more just like it. Head to our YouTube channel or visit us at bfapodcast.us. And you can also listen to us on iTunes, Spotify, or by downloading our free AMAC News app. Don't forget to follow us wherever you are on social media. Until next time, I'm Rebecca Weber. This is your podcast, Better for America. Thank you for being here. God bless you, and have a wonderful evening.